So I played the demo for Slay the Princess back in 2020, and while I liked it then, I did not expect to fall as head over heels in love with the full game like I did. I've played through it so many times and just could not stop thinking about it to the point where I just had to make a video. So today we're going to be taking a dive into the characters in the story and fleshing out who they are, where they came from, and what they represent. It's deeper than you think, especially when you realize just how many routes there are. Speaking of, shout out to Reddit user Mushroom Gleba for their route web, which saved me about 8 billion additional playthroughs. Also, this video will contain spoilers for the entirety of the game, as well as some potentially spooky or graphic imagery, though the worst of it will be blurred to stay in Papa YouTube's good graces. So allow me to give a brief outline for those of you who haven't played or who just need a refresher. You come to in the middle of the woods. A narrator tells you that there's a princess locked in a basement of a cabin and you have to slay her to prevent the end of the world. You can try to ask him as many questions as you want, but he'll always keep things vague, insisting that she just needs to be killed and you're the only one who can do it. But maybe you don't really trust this strange disembodied voice you just met, so you opt to skip taking the blade when it's presented to you and just talk to the princess first to figure out what's going on. As a polite starter, you ask her name. She pauses, thinking about it, before responding that you can just call her your Royal Highness, or Princess if you prefer. If you're like, is Princess your name? She'll hesitate before admitting that she's been down here so long she must have forgotten her name. Which is kind of weird. So then you might be like, what have you been eating or drinking all this time? She dodges the question. But if you ask her about ending the world, she's confused, insisting that she doesn't want to end the world and doesn't even know how she would go about doing that. Maybe even though you don't know who to trust at this point, you agree to try to find a key to unlock her chains. But the door closes and locks before you can get there, and with no other way to get out, the princess voluntarily starts chewing through her arm. And you think, oh, I guess everything's normal after all. The blade suddenly drops at your feet, and you're given the options to either slay or save her. It doesn't really matter which route you go down, because it will end in either you or both of you dying and everything going dark before you're met with the Chapter 2 title card and wake up in the middle of the woods with the narrator telling you that there's a princess locked in a basement of a cabin and you have to slay her to prevent the end of the world. But regardless of you insisting that you've already been here and done this before, the narrator refutes that you haven't, and this is the first time that any of this is happening. Once you make your way to the cabin and the surroundings have changed, you know this is not the case, and the princess, who has changed herself, remembering you only solidifies this. You go through multiple chapters of killing or being killed before you find yourself in a void of sorts in front of a mirror that shows your reflection. And then, if things hadn't taken a left turn before, they make a full U-turn as you meet an entity that holds the version of the princess that you ended the last chapter with. This being waxes poetic, expressing that she is solitary lights in an empty city, thoughts without connections that wishes to be more, and requests that you bring her more vessels or perspectives so she can discover the truth about her nature as well as yours. And then you find yourself back in Chapter 1, not remembering anything of your previous experiences. And thus the game is born. You play out different scenarios of aggression or pacifism and discover new versions of the princess, all of whom are fated to be consumed by the entity who lives in what's called the Long Quiet. Each time you bring the entity a new perspective, you learn more about her nature, your nature, and possibly what lies beyond. And once you have brought the entity 5 vessels, the truth gets revealed. You get to see the narrator, or an echo of him as the game says, and ask him a limited number of questions before he shatters permanently. You learn that you are the Long Quiet, and that the other entity is the Shifting Mound, which... oh, what a name. And that you two are gods that were once one, separated by the narrator so that you could destroy her and rid the world of death which she contains in her multitudes. It's a lot. I'll expand on all of that in a second. And then you come face to face with the Shifting Mound, now fully aware of who both of you are, and you have to make a final decision on how things will end. Now, while a lot of answers are revealed in the last section of the game, there's still a whole lot of mystery surrounding these beings and what everything means. So let's go through one by one and try to shed some light on everything, starting with the narrator. The narrator takes on the appearance of a crow or raven-esque being, both members of the Corvid family. And I add the esque being part because he has sharp teeth as well. Then there's the whole talking thing, I guess. Crows and ravens are very commonly associated with death, which is fitting since death is a common theme throughout the game. Now, it is possible that this isn't actually what the narrator looks like. After all, we see him by looking into a mirror, so it's possible that what we're seeing is the protagonist's reflection channeling the narrator. However, he does have a line that says, "You were never supposed to see me," so I'm gonna assume that this is actually what the narrator looks like. Either way, he explains that he used to be mortal, the term mortal being distinctly different from human, and that he was witness to the end of days in his world, watching a oblivion threatened to end the very memory of everything he knew and loved. Fearing this, he tore the cycle of life and death itself in two and shaped the fraying threads into two gods, the shifting mound, which contained death, and the long quiet, who was created to kill the other god and thus bring an end to death. He also created a construct to hold you both until the job was done, guiding your hand, in this case giving you specific options, and resetting if the mission failed. The term construct here is sort of a play on words, since they are both physically constricted by a finite plane that was constructed, but are also mentally constricted by the definition of construct that is an idea or imaginary situation. Here, putting limits and definitions on concepts that are limitless and undefinable. Anyway, the narrator discloses that the construct exists in every world at once, and that it was designed to restart and shunt both you and her into a new world anytime you didn't kill the princess or thought yourself dead. The final issue, however, was that due to the shifting mound's nature of becoming whatever a living being perceived her to be, the narrator couldn't stay alive because he knew what she was capable of. So he killed himself, in the process tucking a part of himself into the folds of the construct and creating an echo of himself that existed in every world. Since an echo can't perceive things in a way that affects the shifting mound, this allowed him to follow along and be an objective voice that pointed you in the direction of slaying the princess. And this is why the narrator you meet in every chapter has no memory of the previous chapter's events. They're all separate echoes of the original creator. But they all share the original creator's knowledge that the princess changes based on the protagonist's thoughts, which is why he fights so hard to keep your thoughts from straying and catastrophizing the situation. When he argues against you or the voices, he's trying to convince you of what he's saying to ensure that you being able to kill the princess is a self-fulfilling prophecy. However, every narrator will deny your claims that things are looping until faced with undeniable proof. And then he's like, ah, shoot, you did loop. And if you ask the narrator in the end why all of the others lied, he posits that they might have thought admitting it to you would have pushed you to realizations that would make finishing your task impossible, or that they could have been in denial that they weren't the first ones you'd met, because that would not only mean that another world had been destroyed already, but that their world was now more at risk since your perspective on the princess had already been altered. The narrator starts out not the most trustworthy person and only gets more irksome the more you learn and the more he tries to stifle that. But his perspective and actions are understandable when you consider his motivation. The narrator is terrified of death, but not just his personal death and not even just the death of people he cares about. He establishes that the bones of the universe are old and that it's on the cusp of its dying breath, with people out there consumed with thoughts of oblivion. To grasp the weightiness of what this must be like, relate it to how 2020 changed our society's perspective as a whole, really forcing us to look at death and the potential for an apocalyptic scenario in a new light and adding a layer of sadness and existentialism to our view of the world. And now imagine how an atmosphere of a world where people are certain that the death of the universe is imminent would feel. Like, society as a whole just constantly thinking about death? Whew. Now there's some tension that can be cut with a pristine blade. I'm so dumb. The narrator desperately wants to change this and believes that killing death itself is the only way to prevent untold trillions from being lost to the cosmic wind, with the entire history of everyone and everything being forgotten along with it. And he not only believes that this will prevent the universe's death, but that it will genuinely make the world a better place. The world he envisions would be rid of suffering, and he describes it as light, burdenless, with no more fear or chaos, and everyone being with the ones they love forever. This was his dream for the world, and to give that to everyone meant ensuring that he could never see it himself. To the narrator, you choosing your own path is an entirely selfish act. He sacrificed his life for the greater good, and not only are you not willing to do the same, but he constantly needs to remind you that there are real people's lives on the line, and that they've done nothing to earn your spiteful refusal of his request. If you question what the big deal about death is, the narrator says that you've never actually experienced death, only playing pretend since your consciousness is actually an unbroken stream and therefore cannot grasp the abject horror of dying. And just as you as a god cannot relate to dying a true death, the narrator cannot relate to the concept of living for an eternity alone, which contributes to his apathy for your perspective. What's more, the narrator literally cannot handle the possibility that what he's certain of might not actually be true. His mind won't allow it. There are a few times in the game that we see this. In the end, if you call him delusional upon learning his intentions, he says,
"I'm only delusional if I'm wrong. And I'm not wrong. I can't be wrong."
In the Spectre route, we have this exchange.
Death, at least as a form of permanence, is just a concept. See, this is why I didn't want you to talk to her. Death is not just a concept, it is an extremely real phenomenon. Don't let her distort your reality. Cold, hard facts exist. The truth exists. It has to.
And in the nightmare route, the princess reenacts the cycle of life and death again and again until the narrator says,
"This is all too much. I can't keep going."
and disappears. The narrator is acting on fear and desperation, exasperated by your inability to grasp what he considers to be the truth. That's not to say he's right, but it does make him a slightly more sympathetic character who, in his mind, has sacrificed himself not only to save infinite lives, but bring eternal bliss to the world by putting an end to death. But now let's take a look at the one he wants to destroy. The narrator says the shifting mound is the ebb and flow, the capacity to change and transformation, or most of it. Basically, she is change, and in being such contains death. She's not the individual princess that we meet in any given chapter, but rather every princess ever all at once. Michelle Yeoh was great in that, by the way. When we first meet her, she doesn't know who or what she actually is, but can feel that you and she are destined for something greater. And that's why she requests that you bring her new vessels that obtain perspective so that she may learn about herself. She also isn't just made up of whichever 5 princesses you encounter in your playthrough, though. Rather, she states that 5 vessels will be enough for gravity to pull the others back to her in order for her to be a singular multitude. And if you're thinking that term sounds like a contradiction, that's because it is. As she says herself, she's a contradiction that cannot be defined. And she's cool! Like, I might be biased, but I love this big lady. Even when you very first meet her, all she wants is her freedom and to gain new perspectives. She empathizes with you, apologizing if she frightened you and promising that the vessel you brought doesn't feel any pain now that it's one with her. As she gains perspectives and you get to talk to her more, she continually demonstrates thoughtfulness, selflessness, and a deep and profound wisdom. Like, there's this lovely exchange, which makes me just go, oh.
It doesn't matter how many times I go back. At least one of us always hurts the other. Doesn't that change you? Doesn't that make you worse?
It changes me, but it doesn't make me worse, nor does it make me care for you any less. Does it make you worse? Do you resent me?
If anything, it makes me like you more. I don't know what that says about me.
It says that your heart is gentle, that even in the darkness you are guided by compassion.
If you thank her for being kind to you, she simply says, why wouldn't I be kind to you? You're the only thing I know that isn't me. And even when you're like, you know at the end of all this I'm gonna kill you, right? Her response is simply,
if that remains your choice when all is said and done, then you may try. But know that I do not wish you harm, even if you attempt to destroy me.
I mean, even when she learns the truth of why she was created and how the narrator wants her dead, she doesn't lose her cool. She merely tells the protagonist not to mind one that fears death. She's such an unfazed baddie. She sees you as an equal, doesn't want to burden you by asking you to bring her anything specific, and cherishes every perspective you bring her, even the ones who suffered greatly in their lives, saying the wounds they have suffered carve texture around her heart, that without them she would be as she was before, alone and without sensation, that she could not feel the joy of having you by her side, for she would not know your absence. And that ties into her perspective on death, that you need the quote-unquote bad times to be able to enjoy the good times, that life without death is devoid of meaning. She sees death as merely a transformation, something only feared by the body and pointlessly to her since the body is not the spirit. Once she's fully self-realized, when asked what she thinks will happen if they leave the construct, she openly says,
this universe dies, and a new one is born, and that one dies, and a new one is born.
But even the very first time you meet her, she believes that the end of something isn't really the end of it. If you ask her if helping her would end the world, she says,
you ask of things that cannot be done. To destroy is merely to reshape, to remold.
Much like how the narrator lacks empathy for the problems of gods, she lacks empathy for the people and the worlds that get destroyed because she sees their fear of death as unfounded, and also believes them to be too small compared to you two for their opinions to matter. To her, you are her only equal and the only other thing that matters. Her deep love for you stems from the fact that you were once one being, and she openly says she can't imagine a world without you and her. In fact, her killing you isn't even a possible ending. That's how much of an impossibility it is to her. And this is where it's important to distinguish between the princess vessels and the shifting mound herself, seeing as the princess kills you many times. But even then, very, very rarely does she actually want to. Take, for example, the witch route, where if you give her the knife, she'll take the opportunity to stab you. But as you lay dying, she tears up and says,
Why? Why did you let me do this?
In the Adversary and Eye of the Needle route, where she is the most bloodthirsty, she wants to fight you as equals, and is happy to kill you over and over because she knows you'll keep getting back up. Your death isn't permanent. In the Burning Grey route, she kills you both in order for you to be together forever, as messed up as that is. Most of the time, her killing you is reactionary to your actions. The Vestals don't have a narrator like you do, and act based on how they're perceived. But to delve into that, we'll move on to the next player in this game. The protagonist is also a Corvid-esque being, much like the narrator, which we see several examples of throughout the game. We see feathers, talons, and in one Adversary run, we can even see your beak on the wall, which is pretty grotesque. The princess also calls you various nicknames like Birdface, Fledgling, and Little Bird, and in the Tower Run says, "Do you think holding shut your beak is enough to stop me from prying it open?" So all things considered, it was likely that when the narrator wove you into existence, he created you in his image, which would also track as to why all of the voices in your head are the same as his. But then why doesn't the princess look and sound the same? Well, from a meta standpoint, in an AMA on Reddit, Abby Howard, the game's artist and co-creator, said it was partly to make the protagonist more distinct from the princess, and the draconian monstrous appearance counterbalanced the princess's visual well. From a lore-based perspective, the narrator couldn't make them both in his image, because it would be a much stranger sell to convince us to fight ourselves, and likely didn't want to risk making her appear as something that wasn't guaranteed to move us to action, so he instead left it up to us. If we ask the narrator why he made her look like a princess, he says he didn't, but he wove the idea of her into something the protagonist's scattered mind could fathom, and that the protagonist chose for that something to be a princess. If we further inquire as to why we thought up a princess, the narrator says this.
Whatever you viewed her as needed to map on some level to what she was. You couldn't just pick something arbitrary and beneath you. I don't know why you settled on a princess specifically, but clearly a princess is what you wanted. Maybe she needed to be beautiful, important, above you, but on a level you could still approach. A herald of things to come.
I would actually add that since we're assigned the hero role, either by ourselves or the narrator, we could have made her a princess because subconsciously we knew that we wanted to save her, as heroes in stories are wont to do. But although she starts as a blank slate princess, our thoughts and actions shape what she appears as and how she acts from the very beginning. The very first time we decide her fate, the very first opportunity is if you refuse to go into the cabin at all, at which point the world breaks and she becomes an amalgamation of many princesses. But if you do go into the cabin, the first time you decide her fate is if you choose to bring the knife or not. If you do choose to bring the knife, she's colder right off the bat, and if you leave it, she's much more gentle. And although it's fair that if someone comes into a room with a knife, you might be more wary right from the get-go, this starts before she ever even sees you with or without the knife. And that's because it's not what she sees, it's what you think. If you choose to take the knife, it's because you think that she might be a threat, so she is. If you leave it, it's because you don't think she'll want to harm you, so she doesn't. She'll even call back to whatever decision you made in the first playthrough if at the end of the game you go back to the cabin, either saying,
"And there you are, knife in hand. It really brings me back."
or,
"And there you are, hands empty. So you don't feel like recreating our first meeting detail for detail."
Of course, your actions matter too. If you don't take the blade and get her to trust you before stabbing her in the back when the narrator possesses you, you'll get the witch in Chapter 2, who doesn't trust you in the slightest, never wanting to turn her back on you and always looking for an opportunity to double-cross you. If you go the complete pacifist route, not taking the blade and freeing her, that'll take you to the damsel in Chapter 2, who fawns over your return and looks much more Disney princess-like. If you free her without question again, you'll notice that when you ask her any questions about what she wants to do now, she'll always default to,
"I just want to make you happy."
And the more you try to get her to have free agency, the more heavily she leans into only wanting to please you, her drawing style simplifying with every question. And this is because through your actions, that's what you wanted. Just a princess to save. Someone helpless to dote on you as a hero with no real agency or complexity to their character. If you take the blade when the narrator drops it down and try to kill her, she'll tear into you with her teeth and claws with an animal ferocity. And if you give up the fight, you see her lick her wounds and nervously back into a dark corner, her eyes glowing in the dark, which is some A+ foreshadowing of her being the beast in Chapter 2. But it's not just one pair of hands on the wheel, because in each chapter you gain a new voice inside your head who contributes to influencing your thoughts, and thus, how she appears and acts. And which voice you get is also tied to your actions and how you died. If you go the beast route, you gain the voice of the hunted. If you go the damsel route, you get the voice of the smitten. And if you go the witch route, where you stab her in the back, you'll get the voice of the opportunist. So on and so forth. While one extra voice can already influence you, you, once there are multiple voices, things get pretty wild. For instance, in the Burning Grey path, which you get from saving the princess, making her the damsel in chapter 2, and then killing the damsel, you then have the voice of the hero, the voice of the smitten, the voice of the cold, and the narrator all in your head. With the voice of the smitten arguing that your love is alive still, and the voice of the cold arguing that she's dead, and the narrator desperately trying to keep things on track. As a result of these conflicting thoughts, you get to the cabin and you have a dead body for the cold and a spectral being that wants to kill you so you can stay together forever for the smitten. So it can get pretty complicated in your head in the later chapters. In that same AMA as before, the other creator, Tony Howard Arias, mentioned that in general they wanted the voice you gained in chapter 2 to be more detrimental to your actions, and wanted the voice you gained in chapter 3 to be more helpful. What's interesting about all these voices are that they also seem to mirror the narrator, pardon the pun. In the Spectre route, if you let the princess possess you, she alludes to the voices being shards of glass on the floor, which calls to mind how the narrator shatters into shards of glass at the end of the game. This could imply one of two things: that the princess is shattering you into smaller fragments, making you weaker like the narrator, or that you are getting stronger by gaining new perspectives. Either way, the one voice that stands out from the rest throughout the entire game is the voice of the hero. He's the only voice you start with, and is the only one who is able to reach you in the final battle with the shifting mound. Fun fact, if on your first playthrough you refuse to go to the cabin and then you choose to go to the cabin at the end of the game, there's not only the princess from that run, but the voice of the contrarian is there as well, and has a great third beat joke that I just would recommend.
That's probably for the best. So you're not going to suggest we throw it out the window? No, we've been through too much for that. And he's gone, so there's no one left to mess with but ourselves. You've gotten serious. Besides, what's the third beat? It isn't funny if I suggest that twice, especially since you never took me up on it last time. There's the guy I know. You actually did it! I know I just told you not to, but I'm proud that you did it anyways. It's like you've finally left the nest. Yeah, just like that it's gone, isn't it? Blade tossed, glass shattered. I guess we'll have to make do without it. There's your third beat. Hey! You're right. Good work. That was really funny.
The girls that get it, it really only hits if you've played like every path like I have. Anyway, the voice of the hero, while not exactly you, because they seem to also be a shard of glass and therefore possibly more like an echo of you, still seems to represent your truest self. Not entirely sure what to think about everything, but notably being a bit skeptical of killing the princess right off the bat. But the biggest question people may still have about the protagonist is what he is supposed to represent if the shifting mound is transformation. If you examine it through the lens of being the shifting mound's opposite, destined to be at odds for eternity, the most straightforward answer is that the long quiet represents the opposite of change, stillness, or stagnation. However, that's only one part of it, and my theory is that it's a bit deeper than that. The long quiet isn't just at odds with the shifting mound. He also works with her, and the two are intertwined. And arguably, there isn't a time when one's alive where they are truly stagnant. Even when you're still, your body's still functioning. Your hair is growing, your cells are changing over. So if the shifting mound, transformation itself, is in charge of everyone and everything's life and death, maybe the long quiet is what's in between that. Not in between life and death, but in between death and life again, where things go after death before being remolded and born anew. Which makes the name The Long Quiet make a lot more sense to me. You die and you go to the long quiet. I mean, heck, playing through the game, whenever you or the princess die or come to an end, where do you go? And this isn't really at odds with the first interpretation either. The long quiet very likely contains stillness in its multitudes. You and she are the same after all, a chorus of contradictions. Now, I have so much more I want to say about this game. We didn't even cover the meaning of all the endings or the incredible deeper messages that this game contains. And trust me, I wanted to make it all one video, but if I put it all in this video, then I wouldn't have the time to edit and release it by Saturday. So there will be a part 2 where we ask and answer some of the most pressing questions. Why can't the narrator see the mirrors? What happened right before the very first time you come to in the woods? Why is there an extra shackle in almost every version of the cabin? And even though they say every ending is valid, is there actually an ending that's supposed to be the best one? All this and more to come, so be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you know the second it comes out. Or if you want to see it earlier, you can become a member of my channel on here or join my Patreon where there are lots of other fun perks too. And for those who haven't played the game, this will give you some time to watch a playthrough or play it yourself. So until next time... Wait, why is that second option even there? I mean, you wouldn't click that.
Goombanna is the wonder why she didn't come to play. Gaming vids that'll make you laugh and think and put them on replay. Intelligent, kind and funny, her community's #1. Stick around and kick your feet up. Goombanna has just begun.